Hi, friends. Host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People, and I'm here to record a video with Ruminations, the topic of which is environmental protections. Now, I have stated before, and I will state again, that I favor federal environmental laws, even though I recognize them to be outside the scope of the constitutional purview of the federal government in general. So, Right Ruminations, I suspect, opposes my position on this, and I would like to start by asking him somewhat to articulate his basic position on U.S. federal environmental regulations, and to find out if, in fact, he does disagree with me on this.
Well, with U.S. federal environmental protections, what I would say is that I view the U.S. Constitution as a kind of gentleman's agreement. So, if there is a power that is not delegated to the federal government, that it then takes on, then I suppose you might view the contract null in a sense because one of the parties to the agreement isn't holding up their end. So, I would say that in theory, I can imagine a situation where there might be a problem that's dire enough that it would actually justify breaking constitutional norms. However, I think that you could not, in good faith, then claim that the rest of the agreement still held. So I would ask, does not your position compromise the structural integrity of the constitutional ethical framework overall?
Well, no, because I'm going to take a TE approach here to this and say that as far as the jurisdictional limits to the federal government that have been imposed by the Constitution go, it is the case both that those have been exceeded and that some still exist. So it is incorrect to say that the contract is null and void. It hasn't been rendered thus by the courts, nor by practice, nor by any actual manner of implementation of constitutional law. So we can see that while constitutional law has been interpreted badly, and we see the federal government exceeding the scope of its appropriate bounds, it's also the case that it is still somewhat bounded. And I would like to see many of those constraints restored, but I don't think that environmental regulation is an area where I do want to see those constraints restored.
Well, the reason that I think that it cannot be interpreted in this way is because that presumes that the U.S. Constitution functions in a way akin to, say, the English Constitution, which is based on precedent, it's based on legal procedure and practice, whereas the U.S. Constitution was explicitly the result of the fact that you had two contending parties, people who were against the Constitution, people who were in favor of it, who then came up with a kind of synthetic agreement. And what I would say is that the U.S. government holds certain powers by virtue of an agreement where it also sacrifices certain powers. And that I think that the kind of ethical concern that would be involved in requiring one party to uphold its end of the bargain and the other party not supersedes your pragmatic evaluation of how we should interpret this.
Okay, remember, the parties involved here do not include the people. They include the states and the federal government. So, to the extent that there's any agreement, it's not an agreement with any citizen. But the other critical thing to note is that the reality of dual sovereignty is given its own jurisdictional purview. Namely, the judiciary determines what the Constitution means. We might say the plain language of the law means X, Y, or Z, and we might be right. And it might be our duty to attempt to return our interpretation of the law as close as possible to the plain meaning of the language of the law. Nevertheless, we also are faced with the fact that we enter into a status quo in which things are different than we might think they ought to be. And so we have different priorities. As president, for example, it is within the purview of my authority to use the Justice Department to challenge some of the excessive excessively broad interpretations of the Constitution that have come heretofore. Do I think that in an ideal world we'd have a constitutional amendment that allowed the environmental regulations that I think we should retain? Yes, absolutely. But I'm looking at what actually can be done from the job of the president and what I want to be done and what I think is actually in the interest of the country. You might say it's always in the interest of the country to uphold the integrity of the constitutional system. And, I mean, the thing is, I understand that I'm splitting the difference here. That I'm both saying it's critical that we be principled and adhere to those constraints, and saying, and here's an exception. You can correctly critique this by saying, Eric, as a consequence, you're being fundamentally arbitrary. You're not applying the same framework across the board. Meow, meow, meow. But, it's like, I've been. This is sort of an SI thing. It's an experiential thing. I've been to China. I lived in Los Angeles prior to all the strict air quality control laws in California. Now, I don't think you and I would necessarily disagree about California having all these strict environmental laws. You'd probably say that's appropriate for the state of California to do.
Yeah, I'd say that that's well within their rights and possibly even desirable.
Okay, so I mean, the thing is, we both agree that, say, pollution doesn't pay any attention to state lines, you know?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, you could make the argument from, say, the right of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce.
I wouldn't make that argument because that's already been way too broadly interpreted and shouldn't be nearly as broadly interpreted as it is, and I wouldn't want to expand the scope of that bullshit.
Yeah, I know you're worried about it with respect to, say, drug laws, but in this case, I mean, I think that the case might be more compelling with something like pollution than with drug laws.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I agree that the case might be more compelling with pollution, and I also understand that we're talking about drawing fine distinctions here legally. That's how the law works. The Constitution will be interpreted in ever increasingly fine distinctions. Well, this particular this particular search was illegal because of meow, 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 and meow, but this one that's almost identical was legal because of meow. It's always going to be like those kind of distinctions are drawn. So I am inclined, in general, to move back up the framework to things that cascade down more completely, as you are. It's like we'd like to see the basic principle of enumerated powers respected. I would too. In the ideal world, I would like to see the basic principle of enumerated powers respected, and I'd like to see a constitutional amendment affording the federal government authority over environmental regulation. And that's how the federal government used to operate. That's why we have an income tax amendment. I may hate it, but I can't claim it's unconstitutional.
Yeah, the people who claim that the income tax amendment was unconstitutional don't know anything about it. It was clearly legitimately passed. But there are two things that I wanted to touch on that you said. One is that the courts, the Supreme Court, namely, has the right to engage in some kind of judicial review as to interpreting what the Constitution says. I would contest that claim because if you go back and you look at the original outline in the Constitution, all of the powers enumerated with respect to the Supreme Court operate contests that cross state lines. So, for example, if Bob steals something from Paul in a different state, then they arbitrate that because the state courts can't. There is actually no enumerated power in the Constitution, if you go back and read it, that actually allows for federal judicial review in order to interpret the extent to which a power is not enumerated to, say, Congress or the president.
Then what's the check on congressional authority besides it respecting the enumerated powers voluntarily?
The veto.
That's the only check on it?
Well, no, there's also the check of the states themselves who are not prohibited from acting, you might say, obliquely if they don't like what the federal government is doing.
I mean, that sounds like a recipe for even more expansive federal power. Look, well, you got to remember, the federal government has more tricks up its sleeves than coercion. It can always say, if you want these highway funds, meow. And that's a more powerful form of extortion, probably, than any kind of mandate that they make.
Sure, but at the same time, you have to realize that in the original configuration, they did not make any provision for things as expansive as what were at the time called internal improvements, which would include things like highway funds and canal building and things of that nature. In fact, they still haven't updated to include those.
Okay, but here's the thing I think you're neglecting to factor in is that what happened is Congress took those expansive powers, claimed them for their own. The president signed those laws, and some of the time, the judiciary allowed them. So it's not like the judiciary is creating this additional space for the government, that for the legislature, for the president or whatever. Those two bodies are claiming those additional powers, and the judiciary is comprising the only check upon those powers.
I don't accept the premise of what you're saying, and that I don't accept the judiciary has really provided much of a reliable check.
I agree. Not enough of a check, but it is nevertheless correct that it is the only meaningful check.
Well, I think that very often, I mean, it's not much of a check that is often utilized to actually reinforce what the Congress and what the president want to do. I mean,
but your
I think
argument is that the judiciary is exceeding the scope of its power, but it's the only thing limiting the scope of the federal government's power at all.
Well, okay, but let me put it this way. The judiciary is one of the bodies that is responsible for quelling state power, which otherwise could be more readily used as a kind of fourth check against the power of any of the one of the three federal branches, which was the original intention of Madison and Jefferson.
Okay, so but aren't you arguing that the judicial interpretation is not legitimate unless it addresses this very narrowly defined kind of case that you've established?
Yeah, my position is that the judiciary holds no constitutional interpretational powers.
Okay, so then you would have a much more expansive federal government then. Under your interpretation, the federal government would be vastly more expansive because, in fact, the thing that has prevented it from being even more expansive than it is the judiciary exercising those powers you say it doesn't have.
No, I disagree with that. The reason I disagree with that,
that's
fact. No, it's not. It is
That's
not
basic
true.
fact. Okay, then
It is not. All right. Let me outline the case for this. Like, if you take something like, whether you agree with it or not, like Roe v. Wade, that didn't come from Congress. That was a superseding of state powers that came from the Supreme Court. Many of the rights. Yes. Many of, like, if you take a look at, and once again, I'm not wanting to get into homosexual marriage here. That's not the point as to whether we agree with that or not. But the point is that has been something which is viewed as a topic that can be arbitrated in many cases by the Supreme Court. Much of the power scope of the Congress and president has been something that Supreme Court has given to it, and much of the states, like the idea that the states don't have the right to secede, is something that they were told by the Supreme Court.
Okay, look, so here's what we can agree on. The Supreme Court does at least several different kinds of things, okay? That is one of the kinds of things the Supreme Court does. In other words, it empowers, it what's called incorporates, okay? When it incorporates a right, it means that right is binding to all of the states. Now, you might disagree whether the Supreme Court has this power or not, and you might say that's one of the things it's doing that's bad. Okay, fine. That is one of the things it does, but it also does other things, right?
That's a lot, though. That's a lot.
Okay, but understand that it does other things. So, for example, when it incorporated the right to free speech, it said state constitutions cannot contravene this. It is a right possessed by the people. Okay? That's, I think, a good decision. Now, you might say it exceeds their scope of their power, and you might say that the secession decision was wrong, and lots of specific decisions are wrong. But the fact that in that instance it constrains the power of the states rather than the federal government does not mean it increases the power of the federal government. It decreases the power of government entirely. So that's a good thing. in that instance, not one instance. Okay, so look, the other thing it does do is it says, no, federal government, you can't make this law. It exceeds the power afforded you by the Constitution. It does that periodically. So, for example, when they try to pass certain kind of gun laws that the Supreme Court says no, that's too far, then it constrains their power.
Well, I think that the ultimate leverage point that we're looking here in terms of argumentation is whether or not the actions of the Supreme Court with respect to preventing government power are offset by the Supreme Court's actions, which are used to intensify government power. And what I would say is that the actions that they have taken against the states provide a kind of unknown quantity, which could very well amount to a power which, if the states had retained them, despite the Supreme Court, that it would have resulted in a more substantial preservation of liberty than what the Supreme Court has defended.
Well, I mean, you got to remember that there's been multiple instances where the federal government has attempted to take too much power, and the Supreme Court has constrained it. Many, many instances. And so it's a complex web of behaviors by the Supreme Court. If we were to remove the power that you want to remove from them, as per your interpretation of the Constitution, government would be more expansive, not less. People would have fewer rights, not more. I'm quite certain of that, because it just is the case that government always tries to take more power, and the only way to stop government from taking more power is to empower a part of government to do that, and that's the judiciary.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical about the possibility of another branch of the same federal body being able to protect against itself. I mean, you have to look at it.
I'm not saying it's done a good enough job. I'm not saying it's done a good enough job. Okay? But I'm saying that the alternative you provide without that check is much worse. And if you and I want to disagree about that predictive conclusion, that's fine. I don't think either of us can really make the case definitively. But I think that, if you look at the scope of what the judiciary has done, and when you say that it's expanded power, it has not. In general, it has allowed government to expand its own power when it shouldn't. And that's unfortunate.
Well, what I would say is that I think that the configuration that I am advocating, indeed, does provide exactly what you are calling for, which is a part of government to provide a check against against the more expansive parts of government. But I think that the states would provide a much more reliable, much more competitive version of that than the Supreme Court would. And there is some empirical evidence for this. I can give you two examples. One is what the United States looked like before the Supreme Court had arrogated the same amount of power to itself that it currently enjoys, which was a much smaller federal government. Yeah. The second is, would it really be good for, say, Great Britain right now? Let's say that there was a European court that had the same power as the Supreme Court in the US, that declared that something like Brexit or secession in the European Union was unconstitutional. Is that a better check than the relative absence of such a body that would allow things like Brexit or any other secessionist movement to proceed?
I'm not here to debate whether or not secession is a good thing, or whether or not the Supreme Court was right to disallow secession in the Civil War of the United States. That's ancient history. We're here to debate specifically environmental regulation. And the thing is, you and I are not far apart regarding states' rights and federal government scope in general. We're basically on the same page. That the federal government should be smaller in scope, should have less jurisdictional authority, less jurisdictional range. My basic position is that if we're going to be trying to pull back the federal government more to its appropriate scope and scale, first of all, we have to be realistic as to what can be actually done. You can't reshape shit as dramatically as you're talking about, not meaningfully. There's no way to accomplish that within the means of getting things done, So I would say there's that. And second, my point is environmental regulations are needed and generally good. Now, I don't know if the federal government necessarily needs to be the author of those, But I do know that, in the status quo, we have varying degrees of environmental regulation across the country, regardless of federal involvement. Arizona has much looser air quality laws than California does.
Well, in my defense, I would not have fixated on the constitutional question had you not framed it in terms of the particular question of the U.S. federal government and environmental laws. So I was contesting the claims that you made about
It's the
the
core.
expansiveness of the legal context.
It's the core question. I mean, it is the core argument against me, which is why I start there. Which is the best argument against me is what you're arguing in favor of is unconstitutional. It's the best argument against me. So, especially for somebody like me who's largely a constitutionalist. That's why I framed it that way. But my point is, I'm also a pragmatist enough to know that I'm arguing this particular thing from a perspective of somebody who wants to actually accomplish things in political office, rather than just speculative sort of thinking about what would be ideal. I guess I don't know if it would be ideal to remove from the federal government that power, even though it will be more consistent with the principal position of the Constitution. It's a thorny question. It's not as cut and dry as Ti would like it to be.
Right. Well, I'm satisfied with my defense on the particular constitutional question, so I think we can move on to other objections. So
Okay.
you were talking. Well, I mean, which I get the sense is what you want to do is to focus on other points of the conversation.
I mean, not necessarily. I just think that we've successfully gotten to where we have probably a core disagreement, which is the overall historical role of the judiciary and whether or not it's provided on balance a more of a check of constraint of government or more of an empowerment of government, and that's sort of just a disagreement of frame, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of comes to a point in debates like this where you actually rub up against first principles, and there's not really actually any kind of objective metric by which to say that your judgment call is better than mine, which I
With
guess
you,
is
I
kind.
do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind
Not
of the.
usually. Not usually. Let me stress that. Usually, that debates aren't nearly this incisive. It's like we're getting to the points.
Right. So yeah, I guess by the time you get to the point where you can't actually, there's no way to test the
Right.
competing assertions, then that's a sign that the debate is actually going well. So.
Right. It means work's being done.
All right. So where would you like to take, where would you like to take it next?
Okay. Well, so for example, there's a lot of federal environmental laws that manifest in ways. These are the ways they manifest when people don't like them. It's like, well, you can't use your property like meow because there's a spotted salamander there and they're endangered, and therefore you can't. Your property is now basically under the control of the federal government. People don't like that at all. I would like to minimize that kind of federal encounter with the populace as much as possible. So when I'm talking about environmental regulations, I love all you spotted salamanders and everything too, but I want a federal government that does not cause individual people problems with their property, as much as I possibly can. So I do want to stress that for those of you who are afraid of those kind of environmental regulations. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do about that kind of shit, but I do want to minimize those kind of showdowns where like the federal government goes, you can't drill on your land because there's a salamander there, and the person goes, what the fuck? And then there's a big court case for years. I want to minimize that shit, okay? Let me start with that disclaimer. But I do think that, I would like to see, for example, land that the United States has timber on that is currently being, say, leased to timber companies, and land for mining and stuff. I'd like to see a general reduction in exploitation of those resources slowly, and preserve more natural spaces as much as I possibly can. I like national parks. I like protected wilderness areas. I think that's important. I want to restore the Salton Sea in California as a wetlands area. Things like that. I'd like to do if I have the wherewithal and stuff to get it done. You know.
Well, in issues like this, where I'm not particularly invested in whether or not there is, say, control on the state level, or if I were able to have my ideal society, I don't feel particularly strongly about what the laws would be. I like to kind of ask myself, well, what would the libertarians say? Even though I'm not a libertarian, and the reason is because I think that they often have elegant answers as to how to go about these problems. And one thing that there are kind of three things I think that they would say. One is, why can you not solve a lot of these issues through litigation, right? So you wouldn't necessarily involve expansion in government power. So if there is a large corporation that is basically rendering the air carcinogenic and it's like impossible to walk down the street, I mean, that could be viewed as an invasion of private property, and it could fall under the category of litigation. It could be something that could be litigated against on the basis of something like the non-aggression principle. What would you think of that?
Well, I mean, I would say my answer is going to be catalytic converters. You've got a bunch of individuals, each producing a small amount of the problem. Then how do you litigate that?
Well, I think that you could. I don't think it would be contradictory to their ethical framework to say that there could be a kind of collective negative effect, but the burden of proof would have to be on the person making the assertion. So, for example, there's a big difference between if you walk down the street and you can actually like taste the fact that your lungs are being poisoned, and something like with climate change where it's clear that the debate on that issue has been rigged. It's been, from the moment I heard of it and set foot in middle school, I was told that I essentially had to believe in this thing. And
Climate
that all
change is real.
Well, it is. I admit that there are aspects of it that are real, but the point is not. My point here is not to raise a debate on climate change. My point is to say that the question of climate change and the extent to which certain actions have caused it has not been conducted in a way that looks as if it's being pushed by honest people.
Well, okay, I will say this, that there has been a lot of presumed solvency, which always annoys me. That's an absolutely fair critique, that because we can articulate the problem, we know how to solve it, and should take those actions now. Incorrect, for sure. Presumed solvency is always a problem in any kind of political discussion, where people think that establishing inherency, namely establishing that there is a problem, gives us some guidance about how to solve it or what to do about it. And that's been the biggest problem in the debate about climate change, is presumed solvency. That necessarily we should have carbon emission cuttings and stuff like that. You know?
Yeah, I mean, my problem with it is basically the behavior of the people who support it, in terms of, I mean, if you were to take any other issue, and the first thing that you ever hear about it in your life is that the time for debate is over and everyone should agree with me, which is essentially what I was taught and what everyone was telling me about it. That is not the behavior of people who actually believe that they have the truth on their side.
Okay.
That is the behavior of people who have a particular agenda.
That's not an argument, because people can have an agenda, be extremely biased, and still be right. As a matter of fact, they were right. The time for arguing about whether or not the climate was changing was, in fact, well over. It was well established by all sorts of physical data. Now, the problem is, then they conflated that to assume the time just to debate about what we should do about it was over, which is not the case. It's a very big distinction, though.
Now, wait a minute. That much longer before I was told these things, if you look at the establishment, the institution of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, they did not put forward a statement of their mission that is in accordance with the scientific method. They said our purpose is to basically pursue an agenda to the effect. Yes, it does, because they're not following the open-ended framework of legitimate scientific inquiry.
That doesn't make them wrong.
No, it doesn't make them wrong. What it means is, what it does is it absolves them of any right to the benefit of the doubt.
I'm not giving them any benefit of the doubt. There's shit tons of evidence out there. It's very clear climate change is happening. Who cares who's saying it? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, but is it clear that it's happening in the sense that they say it is for the reasons that they say it is?
I'm not quoting, when I think about climate change, I'm not quoting them. I've argued both sides of the issue plenty. I'm a debate coach, remember. The best argument against it is we don't know what the curve is on carbon. So we don't know if it's going to be a diminishing returns thing. It may stop increasing temperature at a certain point. There's lots of arguments against carbon-based solutions, like especially carbon-cutting solutions.
Okay, but what I will say is that I am not an expert, and that I have basically been told what to think about this, and I think that the benefit of the doubt is on the person who is requiring me to take a certain action to address the problem that they have identified.
There's a lot of wrong people, I agree.
Right. So the question is, yes, okay. The question is not, do you and I think that climate change exists to a particular extent or not? The question is whether or not the solutions that are being pushed on people such as myself or on the population on the basis of a irresponsible methodology by which those conclusions are drawn, is that adequate basis for that action? And I would say no.
Okay, bad discourse is bad and bad policy is bad. Okay? I agree with those basic statements. Bad discourse is bad. Bad policy is bad. But it's like, it seems to me like you're trying to create an enemy here. That there's them out there who's trying to push this agenda. Everyone's always trying to push agendas. That's what people do.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that the burden of proof is on whoever is trying to...
The burden of proof for what advocacy, though? That climate change exists?
No. The burden of proof on policy that's predicated on the belief in man-made climate change that has a particular cause is on the people who are conducting the research. And I'm saying that they have not been following a methodology that is worthy of that benefit of the doubt.
Okay, well, look, fine. But we have lots of independent ways to confirm that climate change is real and lots of good reason to think it's anthropogenic. However, it's anthropogenic starting like 10,000 years ago. At least, not anthropogenic starting 100 years ago. Granted, it's ramped up substantially in the last 100 years. Regardless of that we are beyond the point of debating the anthropogenic nature of it or whatever. Those things are cut and dry and I mean, empirically, they have been verified on so many different levels, it's ridiculous. So the problem, though, is you're focusing on the wrong part of the debate. It doesn't matter if the people were ill-intentioned or biased or whatever, had a wrong agenda, had disinformation campaigns, or anything like that. The fact is, anthropogenic climate change is a real thing. Now, what we should do about it is a debate that we need to start having instead of pretending as though that debate's over. People want to collapse it to this ridiculous debate that's irrelevant. It's like, it doesn't even matter if it's anthropogenic. It is a thing that's happening. Should we do something about it? And if so, what are the questions? And if we try to go back to this thing, you're empowering people who think that anybody who has sensible policy recommendations on climate change is in the camp of people who doubt the anthropogenic nature of climate change. That's simply not the case. I totally am with those people on the fact that, yes, climate change is real. Yes, humans started it, and I don't care what their motivations are. I do care, however, about the bullshit when they say they presume solvency and assume that we should do X, Y, and Z when that's not been argued at all. That's where their burden of proof lies, because that's when they're actually advocating doing something.
Yes, but you and I know that the people that I'm talking about are not just people who have been arguing in favor of climate change. They have implicitly included all kinds of policy recommendations as if they just sprung off the page. So, I mean, I would say Yeah, I would say that you should do me the service of basically recognizing that I am talking about people who have policy recommendations, not just the question of whether or not the
Right.
phenomenon of warming
Okay,
exists.
fine. I agree. And you and I are probably on the same page about many of those policy recommendations. We probably oppose most of the same ones. I certainly oppose carbon taxes. I certainly oppose carbon caps. Our unilateral carbon caps are a terrible idea. Unilaterally reducing carbon, or having the West reduce carbon while India and China and Brazil and Russia all just continue producing more dirtily to fill the gap that we leave open, is a stupid idea. It's just stupid. And so we shouldn't do stupid things. That's obviously the case. But I think that we're always making a mistake when we try to focus on sort of the this group of people who's doing this thing is ill-intentioned and disinformation campaigns. That's silly. You know, we worry about the advocacies. Those are the real things. Advocacies are real. Advocacies we should oppose or affirm. People are stupid. I mean, everybody is. Everybody's stupid about something. So to presume that there's some sort of cabalish intentionality to things, of course there is sometimes. But there's lots of different little cabalish things all opposing each other. And
Yeah, I think that your position sounds like no matter what position is the prevalent orthodoxy in society, that's the way people are going to be behaving about it, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. So you don't want to fixate on something that's going to exist regardless. You want to focus on the particular issue.
well, yeah, I mean, I like to focus on things that I can argue better. Basically, advocacies are easier to argue because people are saying we should do X, and then you can lay into that. You know, whereas if they're saying we should believe X, it's a much trickier kind of thing to argue.
Right. I mean, I guess where I'm coming from, why I would even think to bring that up, is just because basically so often, not you, but in general, right, the argument that I'm confronted with is scientists agree on X, Y, and Z, therefore you should too. And I'm saying, now, wait a minute. Like, this is a selective group of scientists, and they have this particular aim, and we can see they're not talking about this the right way. So perhaps I'm projecting those objections onto your objections.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree that science is sometimes full of shit. For example, you know,
Look, science says is a stupid mentality.
yeah, like I'm against I negate evolution. Evolution makes certain claims about explaining origin of the species and explaining speciation that it utterly fails to uphold. It fails to fulfill its burden to affirm completely. So that's my position on evolution. So you can see that I'm not somebody who arbitrarily goes with scientists, because you can have a mass of scientists, a whole world full of scientists, completely wrong about something. For example, evolution.
Right. Okay, so with respect to, I'd mentioned litigation, the other two things I have in mind, like if I were to provide a kind of counter proposal for for addressing environmental concerns, in addition to the litigation, I would say that furthermore, people have to be able to more easily create businesses. And by that, I mean that the mega corporations that are basically upheld in their monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic state are able to maintain that position because of various regulations that make it more difficult for competitors to enter the marketplace, and that you probably would not have the kind of complacency that leads to the degree of pollution that you see if there was more flexibility. And I think that Eric is...
That's right on the nose, mister. That's right on the nose.
Okay. I thought you were implying that I was making some kind of ethnic accusation regarding that issue. I did not.
No, I'm saying you're right on the nose about that. We do need
Okay.
less regulation to encourage more competition by small businesses who can actually compete with these massive corporations. I totally agree with that.
And the other one, and this is a little more difficult to articulate, but I think that people need to be allowed to. I think that there's an additional role that private property protection has in basically allowing people to preserve facsimiles of natural wildlife areas without these being subjected to, say, public domain or being subjected to pollution by third parties. And that kind of bleeds into the first question of litigation. But I would say that my basic case is that those three things, more flexibility in the market.
Can you explain the third
just
one again? Hold on. Can you explain the third one again? I was sort of not paying attention for a second.
No, it's just that basically, with respect to the wildlife preservation question, I think that bleeds into the first question of litigation. That there needs to be more protection for people who wish to preserve, let's say, expanses of wildlife, without being overridden by, say, public domain or pollution or intrusions by other parties. So basically, together, basically, the right to preserve a certain degree of wildlife land privately, together with more flexibility in the market, together with a more expansive role for pollution and environmental violation litigation, that those three things together might constitute some kind of approximation that would achieve the sort of teeth that you would desire for addressing environmental issues.
Okay, well, I'm going to go a little debate on you here. I'm going to say permute, do both. There's no reason why we can't have those solutions and additionally justify certain federal environmental regulations in a totally utilitarian framework. If sort of bolstering preservation is the goal, then under that metric, AF still wins.
Well, I mean, what I would say is that since you are balancing the principles of your devotion to a constitutional matrix while still looking to achieve a certain pragmatic end result, I would say that it would be incumbent on you to first look for those solutions that are in keeping with your prior matrix before you move on to supporting solutions that involve more expansive extra legal powers. And in that sense, until you've exhausted all the possibilities,
hold on.
You should not move on to your initial proposal.
That's a great argument, except don't all your solutions already exist in the status quo?
No, I don't, especially not the easy entry into the business market.
Okay, well, that one
all
doesn't.
the restrictions.
That one doesn't. Okay, that one doesn't.
And that's a pretty important one.
Don't the litigative solutions exist in the status quo?
I think that the reason that they don't really exist is because they're so subject to, say, things like balance tests. Like, if you have, say, a corporation that pollutes a small private property owner, then they can essentially pay for that in the form of a tax, let's say, or a fine, in a way that wouldn't make sense if you were talking about man to man. And so in that sense, I think that they deserve more severe punishments. You have to kind of imagine, what would you want them to do if it was just one person against one person without these kind of corporate exceptions based on limited liability.
Okay. Well, I think what we're getting down to here is the desperate need for a specific concrete example of some kind of environmental legislation or regulation that I particularly support that you oppose. And I don't have one at my disposal right now, unfortunately. This is sort of a general position of mine. I don't actually have any specific advocacies, except my advocacy that I would like to see the federal government somehow facilitate or maybe take over from California or something, the Salton Sea, and return it to its former glory. But I don't know if you oppose that or not.
No,
quite specific.
I mean, yeah, it sounds like a concrete aim that is not in danger of the emotionality of utopian excesses. So, in that sense, I think it's a laudable end to have in mind that is not quite as fanatical as what one might often associate with environmental advocacy.
Okay, well, you know what? This seems like a good place to end the video. I think we can call it basically a draw here. It was more of a great discussion of complex issues than it was a debate most of the time, which is great too. I love that, and I think we did good rhetorical work here.
I did. Do you mind if I just show my channel for a second?
Please do, please. I'm always forgetting about that FE stuff. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, so I have a channel called Right Ruminations. I do book reviews, talk about politics, conversations like this one, philosophy, and so forth. I also do regular weekly conversations on the Praise of Folly podcast, which are linked to on my channel. So again, that's Right Ruminations, and that's a YouTube channel. Thanks, Eric, for having me on and having this discussion.
Always a pleasure. You're a great thinker, and it's you and I. I always enjoy our discourse. It's it's civilized.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.